Nikki, we ready?
We are ready. The recording has started.
Okay, very good. Good afternoon. Welcome everyone to today's public workshop on the CTD Annual Operating Report, the AOR. The purpose of the workshop is to provide an overview of the AOR system and to gather input from stakeholders about ways we can improve the use and accuracy of data reported on the AOR. We are facilitating this workshop through Microsoft Teams. If everyone will please mute their lines. Thank you. This meeting is being recorded and will be posted on the CTD website. All verbal, written, and text, i.e. the chat box, feedback provided in this workshop will be summarized in a final report to the Commission. My name is Commissioner Renee Knight, and I have served on the Commission for the Transportation Disadvantaged since 2019. I am the chair of the advisory work group that has assisted in the development of this study. I want to thank the members of the work group for their time and input, including Chris Stevenson from Senior Resource Association, Sean Mitchells from Big Bend Transit, Lynn Godfrey from North Central Florida Regional Planning Council, Gabe Matthews, Kent Carroll, Krista Carter, our agency advisors from FDOT, APD, and Elder Affairs. This year, the Commission contracted with Thomas Howell Ferguson to conduct a study to improve the use and accuracy of data reported in the AOR, particularly related to the trips performed by Community Transportation Coordinators, the CTCs. This workshop is part of the deliverable of that study. The goal of this workshop are to, number one, provide an overview of the AOR and current challenges with reporting verifiable data. Number two, discuss the objectives of this study and explore an alternative approach of gathering this data for future reports. And number three is gather input from stakeholders on this alternative approach and information presented in this workshop. David Darm, CTD Executive Director, and Casey Perkins, representing Thomas Howell Ferguson, will provide a presentation on the AOR and study. We will then invite participants to provide public comments. And we will conclude with guidance for stakeholders to provide additional feedback for the Commission and discuss next steps for the study. Before we begin, the meeting rules. Number one, this is considered a public workshop and is operating under Florida's government and the Sunshine Act. As mentioned, this meeting is being recorded, and a summary of all feedback received will be compiled in a final report to the Commission. Number two, no action will be taken during today's meeting. However, the discussion may lead to future action by the Commission Board. We advise commissioners who are on the webinar to not communicate privately via the chat box with other board members in order to ensure discussions remain within the sunshine. Number three, for the public comment segment of this workshop, we ask that webinar participants indicate in the chat box if they are interested in speaking. We will then invite participants on the phone to unmute their lines if they are interested in speaking. Again, we will conclude the workshop with guidance on how stakeholders can provide additional comments for the purpose of this study. Number four, all speakers must identify their name, organization represented, and county of residence. Speakers are limited to 5 minutes for public input. We ask that public comments be directed to the AOR and information presented in this workshop. We will not respond to comments on issues that go beyond the scope of this study. We will now turn it over to David Darm to lead the presentation portion of this workshop.
Thank you, Commissioner Knight. If we could, Nikki, if you would move to the next slide. Thank you. Thank you for that introduction, Commissioner, and thank you to all of you for taking time out of your day to be a part of this workshop. Again, my name is David Dunn. I'm the Executive Director of the Commission. I'm pleased also here to introduce our team here at Thomas Howell, who's assisting us with this study. Casey Perkins, who will be presenting most of the material today. We also have Jeff Barbacci and Nikki Champion from Thomas Howell, who are assisting on the, holding the webinar and providing any technical assistance. So thank you all for your efforts in helping us put this together and coordinating this event. To kind of set things off, I'll go to the next slide. To set the tone for today's discussion, for those of you who've been following a lot of our initiatives over the last few years, we have been really putting a stronger emphasis, I'd say, in the use of data and the accuracy of data and how it can help us make better decisions as an organization. And as a part of that, I'd like to kind of set the tone for this discussion using a quote from a very famous statistician, very influential during the 20th century. Mr. Deming here had a quote that he was famous for saying that in God we trust, but in all else, people must bring data. And data is really important. It is information that helps us to be able to make the decisions that are in the best interest of the program as a whole, to understand the challenges that our systems are facing, and being able to, as a part of this discussion, we will be just, looking at not just what the commission's decisions are making, but also looking at it as the legislature, as what a lot of this information is going to, as they're the target audience, as well as the governor's office, who are state policymakers that make, legislation or budget decisions that impact our program, impact our field. So it's important that we, as a system-wide view, look at how the data can be able to shape those decisions in a way that improves and enhances our mission and our purpose. So on the next slide, to kind of go further into Deming's philosophy, that I think using this as an analogy to going into the discussion of the AOR. Next slide. We wanted to use an example. Deming was known for particularly looking at the Japanese economy after World War II and helping them rebuild, reshape themselves. And one of the philosophies that he had was in a focus on quality. And that we took an example of the assembly line, which back in the 1950s, the assembly line from the American side, it had as a system-wide goal of efficiency. That was to move the line. And as the workers' responsibility went, their job was to keep the line moving no matter what. The responsibility of the quality, though it was still a goal of the system, it wasn't as a priority as much as efficiency was. As far as quality goes, that was the responsibility of the management and the inspectors to be able to determine whether the product had meet its quality standards. Conversely, if you looked at the Japanese model back in the 1950s, they took a lot of what Deming had taught, and then of course led to what you see like with Toyota and other companies that had a philosophy with a priority in quality as opposed to just efficiency. And in that view, it was the responsibility of the workers system-wide, not just the management, to ensure that the quality of the product was not harmed in the pursuit of the assembly line efficiency side of it. And so in that system, they empowered their workers to be able to stop the line if they noticed that the quality was not good. The reason why I use this as an analogy to set the stage for this discussion is when it comes to this report, a lot of you in the system may not necessarily understand fully why this data is important. Perhaps you might see this as simply just a compliance requirement that you're just like all the other requirements that you have to do for the federal government or the state government. I will never forget a session during one of our conferences where the question was posed, why is it important that the data be accurate? And somebody said, well, that's because the commission told us to. And so I would like for this to be in importance of changing the way we think of these requirements, not simply just because the commission is asking of this, and this is a requirement that is on us as the commission, but as a responsibility from all levels, from those of you who are individually collecting these trip numbers and putting it into our system, all the way through our team, my level, the commissioner's level, and ultimately the conversations that happen with the legislative staff and the governor's office. It's incumbent upon us that we get this information right, that we truly understand why this is important and how it can improve our services. So with that, I will turn it over to Casey to give into the study and some of the objectives that we would like to accomplish today. And I will bring it back into conclusion. So with that, Casey, you have the floor.
All right, thank you, David. And before I get into the background, I just want to reemphasize at the outset that the best way to really view today's workshop or think about it is as a kickoff in the process of collecting feedback from all of you who are in workshop today in terms of the AOR in general, as well as more specifically, some of the concepts we're exploring as part of this study. But to get to the background on the AOR is a report consisting of data. The CTC is reported to the commission every year, so the data is reported annually. And it includes trip totals broken down by variables such as funding source, trip purpose, service type, etc. Funding source really means trips provided not just in CTD's programs, but outside of CTD's own programs as well. It also includes other operational data such as financial data and vehicle data, but trips are the primary source of information as relates to what services are being provided to the TD population. So that's really going to be the focus of the study we do. And then finally, the AOR is a large piece of the annual performance report, or APR, that is officially submitted to the governor and Florida legislature on January 1 of each year. Next slide. So why does CTD collect AOR data? The simple answer is statute, specifically Chapter 427. The data submitted by CTCs is primarily what makes up the AOR currently, and so that's really the focus of this study is the data submitted by the CTCs for the AOR. Going to the third bullet on this slide, you can see how sweeping the statutory language is. It says all available information. And this is why the commission, through the AOR, collects data on transportation services beyond those provided under the Trip and Equipment Grant. And then finally, going to the bottom of this slide, the APR is the vehicle or means through which this statute is complied with or followed. Next slide. Getting to this study's purpose and objectives. Across the top here is the official articulated purpose of the study, which is to improve the accuracy and analyses of data in the AOR. It's important to note here that this study that we are doing, it's really focused on data. It's not focused on IT needs or solutions. Those could be things that are needed following this study, but that is not a focus of this particular study. So the study has three main objectives though, laid out across the bottom there. First objective, assess the current role of the AOR in terms of how data is reported by CTCs and collected by the commission. Second objective, verify. Generally speaking, whenever we collect data on anything, in any situation, not just in this case, but all cases, we want confidence that the data is telling us what we think it seems to be telling us. Nobody wants to rely on invalid data or misinterpret the data. And objective 3, analyze. Analysis is the ultimate aim behind collecting data in the first place. We want to have an idea of the sorts of questions we're trying to answer, the sorts of insights we're trying to gain. Next slide. So the three objectives are really going to be the outline of what I present here in the next few slides. So starting with the first objective, assess. Go to next slide. So here we have an example of what is in the AOR and what it tells us about a specific service area, in this case, Indian River. The CTC for Indian River is participating in this study's work group, so that's why we've chosen them as an example here. But the summary shown here It's similar to any other service area. Every service area has a summary as you see here. And in this example, I want to focus your attention on the data relating to trips on the left-hand side. Indian River reported 61,377 trips, and the AOR breaks down these trips in 4 different ways. First way, service type. Second way, trip purpose. Third way, funding source or revenue source. Fourth way, provider type. And the key takeaway here is that the AOR is aggregated. That word aggregated, it's very important. That is, CTCs do not provide the commission with raw data on trips or services provided to the TD population in their county. Rather, they report summarized data. So in this example, Indian River summarized its 61,377 trips in 4 different ways. And this is how it is done for every county in the AOR. Next slide. So summarizing or aggregating data like the AOR does, it has its advantages. It also has its disadvantages. The primary strength of aggregated data, like you just saw, is in its summarized presentation and quick takeaways. Summarized information is more digestible. It's more easily interpreted compared to a raw data table consisting of 61,000 rows. You know, if it were not, there'd really be no purpose to it. But at the same time, summarized information, it can cover up important details. There may be more to the story than what is being presented in a summary, in which case it is beneficial to be able to go into the raw data set behind it and do some investigating. So we highlight this distinction between aggregated and disaggregated data because deciding the extent to which you want data reported to you to be aggregated or disaggregated, it's of fundamental importance to what you want the data to be able to tell you, what you want to be able to extract from it. Next slide. So we're going to go with an example here. As mentioned on the previous slide, the primary advantage of aggregated data lies in its presentation. So just by looking at the summarized information, you can immediately take away some key insights. So as an example, Indian River's AOR summary, by just glancing at it, we can see that 13,834 trips were trips funded by CTD. Similarly, we can also see that 5,312 trips were for the purpose of helping the TD rider with employment. You can't do this looking at a raw data table of some 61,000 rows. But aggregated data, it's limited when it comes to more granular analysis. Analysis becomes more granular when you start asking or attempting to answer questions with multiple levels to them. So the weakness of aggregated data lies in when we try to answer more precise or specific questions about our data. So going back to the example with Indian River, even though we know how many trips are CTD trips, and we also know how many are for the purpose of employment, we can't figure out how many CTD trips were for the purpose of employment because the data provided in its current format, it's not broken down to that level of detail. Next slide. Going to the second objective. Next slide. So verification. At a fundamental level, verification, it's just another form of analysis. At heart, it's a method of answering questions about or evaluating claims. So in the same way that aggregated or summarized data is limited when it comes to analysis, it's limited similarly when it comes to verification also. So with the current AOR, trip data is aggregated in the summary in 4 different ways. Making sure these 4 different summaries all total to the same amount, that's one way of verifying their validity. But that's where the verification really ends. There is no audit trail behind it for backing up these totals. Next slide. So what do I mean by audit trail? So let's use CTD's invoices as an analogy, and these can be trip and equipment grant invoices or ISD grant invoices. It's all the same template. But CTD's invoices, they have a summary tab. And this summary tab, it's similar to the summaries in the AOR. You know, trip totals are a primary feature of it. But these summaries have backup documentation required to be provided along with them. So let's take a look at the number of trips for ambulatory there. It says 500 trips. As an analogy, that's where the AOR ends. It tells you how many total trips there are. Next slide. But with CTD's invoices, with CTD invoices, that 500, it needs to be backed up with raw data on the trips behind it. So that this raw data, it's data in its most disaggregated format. It's the opposite of aggregated data. So this raw data, it serves as the audit trail that can be followed from the totals in the summary tab. The totals in the summary tab must be reconciled to the raw data, raw trip data in the backup tabs before they are accepted as valid. Next slide. And so this difference between not having an audit trail in the AOR and having an audit trail in the trip and equipment grant invoices, it was a key factor in swapping the AOR for the invoice data when it came to overhauling the trip and equipment grants allocation methodology beginning in state fiscal year 2021-2022. It was not necessarily the only factor behind that decision, but it was the overriding factor, I would say. So the reason for that is the thinking was if an audit trail is important to have for purposes of reimbursement, then arguably it should be similarly important to the determination of funding allocations as well. Those funding allocations are directly tied to the reimbursement. So while conceptually the debate between having or including non-CTD trips in the AOR for the allocation methodology was worth having, the lack of confidence in the AOR's data really precluded its consideration. Next slide. I'll just point out that this lack of confidence in the AOR's validity or ability to verify the numbers reported in it, it was something we actually heard from the field. It's not something we started with as an assumption. I mean, this is a quote provided as part of the feedback of that study on the allocation methodology a few years back. But there were other quotes as well. We provided this one as an example because it's the most verbose, probably the best articulated. But this was something that right at the outset of that study proved to be very problematic. Next slide. So getting to the third objective, analyze. Next slide. So as was mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, the AOR is a large piece of the annual performance report, or APR, that is submitted to the governor and legislature by January 1 of each year. The executive summary of that APR report, it highlights this at the outset by identifying the AOR as one of two primary sources of data analyzed in the report, with the other primary source of data being the trip and equipment grant invoice data. So as it currently stands, compared to the AOR, the trip and equipment grant invoice data, it's much more granular in its detail. We saw that with the raw data in the previous slide. And obviously it's specific to the commission's own program. So hence the executive summary making the distinction between two data sets as micro versus macro views of TD services. Next slide. So at a high level, the APR's format allows for CTD services to be evaluated within the context of TD services across the board. So we're going back to Indian River's example here in their AOR. At a high level, we can see that of those 61,377 trips, 13,834 trips were under CTD's programs. But we can't dig any deeper. We can only figure out the total number of CTD trips. For example, if I want to know how many CTD trips were for the purpose of employment, I can't extract that insight here. I can only see that there were a total of 5,312 trips for employment, but I don't know the revenue sources behind those 5,312 trips. Next slide. Here, this example is the same one used earlier in the presentation when introducing the concept of aggregated versus disaggregated data. Analysis becomes more granular when you start asking or attempting to answer questions at multiple levels. And aggregated data is by definition limited in its granularity. But to help demonstrate the enhanced analytical power behind disaggregating data, Indian River was kind enough to supply us with the raw data behind their 2021 AOR submission, which we then used to answer the question of how many CTD trips were for the purpose of employment. The answer is 3,117. And with that raw data, we're actually able to figure out how all of the CTD trips broke down by trip purpose. And so that's the last objective that really kind of concludes the outline, the conceptual outline of the study as we're currently conducting it. Before I kick it back to David, though, I want to really go to help you understand what we're thinking in terms of how we would collect the raw data behind these summarized AOR data. So what we have here is it's just a test website. And from this site, you can go to the Excel. So this is a hypothetical. You can see like a lot of the things are just kind of filled in. But this is a hypothetical raw data set, backup data set behind an AOR submission. And a lot of it's made up, like I said, there's no personal information, real world information being done here. But on the far right 4 columns, those are actually the 4 ways that the AOR is currently summarizing its trip data. So you'll see the first column, it's trip type, and that breaks down by fixed route, TNC, etc. Next column, trip purpose, medical, educational, employment. Third type, revenue source, APD, elder affairs, CTD. And then finally, provider type, transportation operator, CTC, coordination contractor. So that's what the raw data would look like. That's kind of how we envision it, going back to the browser. So the way that this would work if we were to go down this road of collecting it, and this is all just for thought exercises. We're not necessarily proposing this at this point, but you would really just, you'd go to some sort of portal, you'd submit your raw backup data, you'd upload it, and then it would be summarized for you. So you could actually check the totals yourself, make sure they add up. And then at the same time, CTD would actually have access to some of the more disaggregated, detailed data to help it perform better analysis.
Under the concept, but we would not be collecting it at this time, the raw data.
Oh, no, we're not collecting any raw data at this point.
Mm.
So anyway, that concludes that. Kick it back to you, Dave.
Great, thank you, Casey. So I'll close out before we get into the public comment on just kind of to say where this study is going, what we'd like to see in the next few months. So what information Casey just shared about this test site, we're gonna present that and ask that folks in the CTC representatives, if you have some time over the next few weeks to be able to test this. I believe there'll be instructions on how to use it.
Sure.
This is just for your benefit to test it to see if we could try this concept of putting a raw data form, uploading it, and you getting to see the summary table. We, the commission, would not be collecting data through this website. This is simply just to test a concept of how that could potentially look if we did want to go down this route in the future. So we would like to request that CTC representatives test this approach using their most recent AOR data. So fiscal year 21-22, that was July 1, 2021 through June 30th, 2022. We'll put the information out there. I'll send an email follow-up to give the specifics of where to go and find that. We're asking that it just be the CTC's data. What I mean by that is not including your coordination contractor data or any other third-party agency that you have no direct oversight as a CTC on. We're simply just interested at this point in looking at the trips that you have direct purview over, whether you're providing them directly for another program or you're contracting those services for your own with your own funding. So that just to clarify what this exercise is meant to do here. We'd like to also collect feedback both on this, using this test upload site, as well as some additional feedback that you can all provide us, which I'll share in a minute on some questions to think about. And we'd ask that you provide that feedback to me by June 16th. So that will be giving you 3 weeks from tomorrow, I believe, to be able to provide that information, and that we will compile that feedback into a report that Thomas Howell is going to put together, and then hope to have a presentation at the August commission meeting in Orlando in conjunction with our conference that will provide some of the findings and some of the summary of the feedback we gotten from y'all, and maybe some recommendations on where we can see going forward with this. Next slide. So as far as feedback, in addition to what Casey shared and the information that we certainly want to hear your thoughts on all of this, we've also provided a few questions here to get you thinking. You don't necessarily have to answer every single question, but it would be nice to be able to get just you an idea of what some of the areas of focus that we're interested in exploring as part of this study and future discussion. So in first thinking about the requirements, I think Casey had shared at the beginning of the presentation, our goal here, our requirements are to ensure that we're getting the most accurate data to the legislature, the governor's office, and the commission themselves. But also, in addition to that, we want to consider your challenges as a system, as CTCs, when you're putting this data together. Please explain to us how the reporting requirements are, what are your challenges? And is this concept that we just presented by where you uploading raw data as an alternative, would that make it easier or more challenging for you as a CTC? So this would be something to think about after you've tested this web page. Should the summarized AOR data of trip totals on non-CTD programs, meaning the trips that CTCs are providing, not with the TD dollars, the trust fund dollars, but maybe for other purposes like the federal grant dollars that you get with 5307 or 5311, if you're doing ADA paratransit trips or doing any other kinds of Medicaid or human service type programs, should those trips continue to be reported in the AOR for future reports? And I would ask that also of the coordination contractors and any of the other data that you as a CTC collect in addition to what you directly are responsible for. Question 3 is kind of a sort of on the flip side, I think, of the alternative would be is, let's say we didn't want necessarily to collect that level of detail in the AOR. Should the invoice data maybe include some of these more specific pieces like passenger type, whether they're elderly, disabled, low income, or the type of purpose of a trip? So is it employment? Is it medical health care? Again, this is a study, so we're just exploring different options, different ideas. It's not necessarily committing to necessarily that we would do this, but just we would like to get your feedback on it. Question 4, Casey referenced about an audit trail and how important it is that we have some kind of support documentation. So we'd like to get your thoughts on that. Should the backup documentation of specific trips be required for future AORs, similar to the way it's required right now with our invoices? And then are there other alternative ways that we could be missing that involves collecting this data and it's ensuring its integrity? So considering if there's other options that you can think of that would be important for us to consider in this study. And then finally, tying this back to where this kind of originated or where we noticed this as a challenge was with our funding formula. So right now, as it sits, we do not use the AOR for funding. It is simply just for performance and our requirements with statute. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we're not open to exploring that as a possibility down the road if we address some of these challenges with the integrity. Should the AOR be considered being revisited as part of funding, particularly as it relates to the extended beyond just what the trip and equipment grant dollars are funding, but also what other funding programs out there that you as CTCs are doing, should that be considered and weighed in the formula for future study? So again, all these questions are just for you all to think about and to weigh in. That doesn't commit us as a commission to necessarily address all this within the next year. But it is certainly something that we're interested in hearing your feedback on. So with that, I will move to the next segment is our public comment segment. I do realize that a lot of this information might be overwhelming, so some of you may need some time to process that. So I did put, I'm asked that you provide additional feedback to me electronically through email. If you wish to do that, then I will compile all that information and send it to Thomas Howell to include as part of their final report to us. So with that, I will turn it over to Nikki and Jeff to monitor the chat box. So for those on the webinar, please indicate if you're interested in speaking, saying your name, and then we will time you for 5 minutes per speaker, and then we'll get to phone participants after we get to the webinar side.
If there's anybody interested in speaking, please just type your name in the chat box and we'll call on you. If you got questions or other comments that you'd like to make. This time, David, we're not showing any.
Okay. How about anyone on the phone? Is there any instructions on how to unmute for phone participants?
Think you could probably unmute your line.
I can unmute your line if they're phone participants that would like to speak.
Okay, we'll give them a few minutes, just in case if anybody has some thoughts. Next slide. Again, we will provide this information as far as where you can go to access the web page and test it. I will be sending out an email request with these questions that we just shared. We'll also put the PowerPoint presentation and the recording on our website when that is available. And then Thomas Howell will start the process of putting the final report together during the summer, hopefully with a list of findings and recommendations that we can present to the full commission in August. So with that, I don't think I have anything else on my end. We'll just give a few more minutes to see if there's any lingering thoughts from the public before we conclude.
No indications in the chat box at this time.
All right. Okay, well, if that's the case, then we'll go ahead and close out. Thank you all for being here for today, and look forward to continuing the discussions in the next few weeks.